Emily. We're looking at my hands today because I want to show you my trick for making my long tail cast-ons as stretchy as I need them to be without having to go up to a bigger needle size or any other sort of trick that I often see recommended. I decided to film this video because I've seen people complaining that their long tail cast-ons are not as stretchy as they need. So if they're doing like the top of a top-down sock, the cuff of a glove, the headband of a hat, anything like that, they make it and they go to put it on and it won't stretch enough to go over the body part they need it to go over. I've always found this kind of an interesting thing because for me, my long tail cast-on is my stretchiest cast-on. Sometimes I see people suggesting instead of using the long tail cast-on, use the German twisted cast-on because it's stretchier. Well, when I tried the German twisted cast-on, it was not stretchier than my long tail until I started treating it like I treat my long tail. And even then, I don't know that it was actually stretchier or if it was just equally stretchy. So I want to show you what I do because by understanding how the long tail cast-on is constructed, I can actually make it as not stretchy or stretchy as I want. And like I said, I don't need to use a larger needle. I don't love the larger needle solution because, one, it doesn't really address the root cause of the problem, and two, I have to remember to have a larger needle and remember to stop using the larger needle after I've cast on. Not that I've made that mistake multiple times or anything. And the other thing, too, to note, so if you're doing a different kind of cast-on, like a backwards loop cast-on or a knit cast-on, switching to a large needle is actually a really good idea to make it stretchier, but not for the long tail, and I'll show you why. For this video, I'm assuming that you already know how to do a long tail cast-on. It's the one where you take your yarn and you get a long tail of it, and you can put it over your fingers and do... I'm not doing it right, hang on. And do this sort of a motion. That's your typical long tail cast on. If you don't know how to do it, there are a number of tutorials out there. I believe that Very Pink Knits, who's my go-to for knitting tutorials, has got several. If you want me to do one, I'm happy to. Just let me know in the comments below. But for right now, we're just going to assume that you already know how to do that, and you're trying to figure out how to make it stretchier. So, for me, the critical thing is understanding why. That's how I remember how to do it. So let's talk about how this long tail cast-on works. And for this, we're going to have two pieces of yarn. I'm just going to knot them together for right now. And this gray yarn is going to play the role of the yarn, the working yarn, the yarn that goes to the ball that we're going to knit from. This browny greeny yarn is going to play the role of the long tail in the long tail cast-on. So pretend that this is all one long piece coming from this ball. And this is my needle that I'm going to cast onto. So I'm going to, put a slip knot on here, we'll say. And I'm going to set it up with my tail going over my thumb and my long, my working yarn is the word I'm looking for, going over my index finger. And I'm going to do my long tail cast on. And I'm just going to casually cast on a ways. And I think part of the problem that happens is this, is people cinch these up so they're really close together when they're casting on. And that's a problem because if you look at this, you can see, okay, let me put my arm around my tripod a different way. You can see the working yarn goes around your needle and the tail yarn goes between the loops of the working yarn. So the working yarn that comes from the ball is this gray yarn that's looping repeatedly around the needle, and this brownish yarn is the yarn that's coming from the tail, and it's not looping around the needle, but it's what controls how far apart you can stretch these things, because if you don't have enough between there, it's not going to stretch anywhere. So if we're done with this cast on and we're going to start knitting, we're going to knit into this. And if you look between these stitches, okay, let me see. Between these, okay, this is not a good one because it's right at the end. All right, between these stitches, you have two strands of yarn. You have your gray yarn that's your working yarn, and it would be gray, but we're doing it separately so you can see it. That's your long tail. And they can stretch a ways, but we're also stealing yarn from each of these to do it. And the reason this is important is if you want these to be able to stretch out more, you have to have both of these long enough. So you have to have your working yarn long enough and your tail yarn long enough. But because your working yarn only loops around your needle and your tail yarn only goes between your working yarn, if you just switch to a bigger needle, you're only changing the length of your working yarn, this gray yarn. You're not extending the length of this brown yarn. So, to go to a sample that I already knit up, this is one where I knit 2x2 ribbing after casting on. And with this one, I cast on with a long tail cast on, but I did it tightly where I cinched all my stitches up really tight against each other as I was casting on. And with this one, it stretches. Okay, let me turn it this way. It stretches, but it doesn't stretch all that far. It goes from about a little over 2 inches wide to a little over 4 inches wide. And the ribbing itself can actually stretch a good bit further than the cast on can stretch. And so this is what is going to get you in trouble if your cast on isn't as stretchy as your ribbing and you're trying to fit it around your ankle and your calf and it's just not fitting if you're starting a sock like this. Obviously this is not the right size for a sock, but you know. So, typical solution says either switch cast-ons, which I don't want to do, or go up a needle size. So if I got a larger needle and I started doing my cast-on like before, so I'm going to go around my tail yarn, get my working yarn. Ooh, knocked my tripod, sorry. So what's happened here is I've still cinched all of these up, but I'm using a larger needle. So my working yarn has increased in size, but my tail yarn has not because it's still the same distance. It's just with these loops on a bigger needle. So when you start to knit off of it, hopefully you'll remember to use the correct size needle. You'll see that this yarn has got a lot of excess in there because you're going from a big needle to a small needle. However, this doesn't have any extra compared to when you just cinched it up tight around this needle because it's the same distance that it's covering. And if you knit a swatch with this, it looks the same as the other swatch, basically. I mean, the length is different, but the width is the same. One difference that I notice is that with this is the one where I cinched it up tightly. Everything looks pretty smooth. With this one, there's more bumps and lumps and unevenness in our working yarn because it was around a bigger needle, so its loops are bigger. Now, if you remember, this one stretched out to, what, 4.5 inches? This one stretches out to, let's see, what's that, 2, 4, 5.5 inches. So you've added a decent amount of stretch onto it. So it does help because you don't have one of those yarns constraining how far you can stretch these suckers. But I think there's a better solution. It gets you a little bit more distance and you don't have to remember to have a bigger needle. So, rip this guy out again. Here's how I cast on when I want it stretchy. When I want it not stretchy, I do it like this and I cinch them up really tight against each other because that'll be the least stretchy. But if I want something stretchy, I'm going to do my first stitch, right? And then I'm going to cast this one on and I'm not going to cinch it up. Instead, I'm going to put my finger right here. Okay, angling. Put my finger right here. I'm going to use my finger to block it. And what I often do is I'll kind of wiggle the yarn back and forth so that way it doesn't like do this sort of motion where it gets in and pulled tighter. I'm going to wiggle this back and forth up here. And there's going to be a big old gap. Now, this is probably the gap I would use if I wanted a super stretchy cast on with a worsted weight yarn. If I was doing like a fingering weight yarn, it would be a much smaller, probably around where my fingernail is. And then I'm going to scoot this all down a little bit. I'm going to make another stitch. I'm going to use my finger, leave a gap, wiggle it a little bit to make sure that my the bottom of this stitch is kind of vertical. Move on. And what ends up happening when you get used to this is it's no slower than before. You're just using your extra finger on here to ensure that, so instead of pulling it all the way against the other thing, you just pull it all the way against your finger. And then, once I've got that, I can scrunch it up once I've already cast it on with that gap. But you'll notice I can stretch this out really far. And when I knit with it, I've got a lot of distance in between here because I've got a good amount of distance from this working yarn, and I've got a lot of distance on this bottom yarn because I stretched both of them out when I made that separation between each of my cast on stitches. And with this guy, this is the one that I did like this, and it stretches, let's see, 2, 4, 6, 7, roughly speaking, 2, 4, 6, 7, about 7 inches. So this one was what, 4? This is 3 inches more. This one was like 5.5. So it was about a, was it 5.5 or was it 6? 2, 4, 5. Oh, it was only 5. Nope, that was my first one. My bad. This one stretches out to about 5 inches. This one with the larger needle stretches out to about 6 inches. And this one with the fix that I have stretches out. Oh, okay. Apparently I could stretch them all out more than I was 2, 4, 6, 7. This one stretches out to about 7 inches. So you get so when you compare the one that you did with everything cinched up and on a larger needle and everything spread out, yeah, this one does stretch significantly more than that, but it doesn't stretch as much as this, and this doesn't require an extra needle, and it gives you flexibility. If you want it not to stretch this much, well, don't stretch them out quite as far. If you want it to only stretch this much, cinch them up really tight. So you can adjust how stretchy you want your cast on if you just adjust how much space you allow there to be between the stitches. And yeah, this one is a little bit messier on the edges, I think, than this one because you've got that extra length going on. But, you know, once you stretch it out, you don't notice it. And personally, I kind of like this look where you've got these kind of longer side loops to this look where you've got these so in this one you've got these extra big loops that are sticking up on top from the working yarn. Throwing things everywhere. On this one you've got some kind of wider loops that kind of lay flat from the tail yarn, and I like the look of that better personally. You won't notice either one nearly as much if you're doing everything with the same color as you normally would. And how much that happens will depend on how much of a larger needle you use or how far you space things out. You probably, I don't know, I didn't actually test what would happen if I used a larger needle and space things out because I have never needed to. Spacing things out has always been sufficiently stretchy for me. I kind of suspect it wouldn't make all that much of a difference simply because when you stretch things out, you're also making more length in the working yarn, which is looped around the needle. So, I hope that made sense. If you have any questions about that, please let me know in the comments down below. Just to recap, I'm going to go back to, instead of doing this with my 2 yarns, I'm going to go back to 1 yarn as if I were doing a normal long tail cast on. And in order to, so tail on this side, in order to make it really stretchy, I'm going to leave large spaces between my cast on stitches, and I'm going to deliberately kind of pull my yarn away rather than in because I don't want to risk them cinching up at all when I need that large space to allow my cast on edge to stretch. And that's all it is. I find it really easy, really fast, and no remembering extra needles when I'm heading out to cast on a project on the go. And my scissors decided to come join the party. So yeah, I hope that you found that helpful and it made sense. And if it didn't, let me know in the comments below. I would love to clarify anything for you. I will hopefully see you next week when I'm going to be doing a video talking about my knitting projects that I have been working on, and hopefully we'll have something completed by then. I have plans, but we will see how they pan out. So hope to talk to you later. Bye.